name is Jonathan Mercer, and I have spent most of my adult life investigating the strange and the inexplicable. People often call me a paranormal investigator, though that title has been warped by television shows and cheap internet videos. For me, it is not entertainment. It is study, documentation, and survival. I have walked through places where the air grows colder than death, where shadows stretch against the laws of light, and where voices emerge from empty corridors to whisper things I should not know. I have seen enough to understand that the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond it is not only thin, but fragile. And when it tears, something always slips through. That understanding is what brought me to Harrington House, an aging mansion crouched on a hill at the edge of Blackwood County. The mansion has stood for nearly 2 centuries, its foundations sunk into the bedrock of a forest that locals avoid even in daylight. The house itself is a legend whispered in taverns and coffee shops across the region, a place mothers mention to frighten their children into obedience. It is said that no one who has spent a full night within its walls has ever been the same afterward. Some returned mute, unable to describe what they saw. Others vanished altogether, as if the house itself consumed them. I was not invited here on a dare or lured by curiosity. I was hired. The estate had recently fallen into the hands of distant relatives of the Harrington bloodline, and with it came the responsibility to settle what to do with the property. They were business people, uninterested in old ghost stories, but keenly aware of the lawsuits that might follow if something unexplainable befell future owners. They contacted me with instructions that were almost laughably simple: spend 1 month in the mansion, document everything, and verify whether the stories had any foundation in reality. If the place was safe, it would be sold. If not, they would have it demolished. Before stepping foot in Harrington House, I was given something far more unsettling than a contract. I was handed a list. It was yellowed, the paper frayed along the edges as though it had been folded and unfolded countless times. Written in spidery ink across the page was a set of rules. There were 12 of them, each brief and absolute. The handwriting was not modern, it belonged to another century. 1. Never enter the east wing after midnight. 2. Do not touch the mirrors on the 2nd floor. 3. If you hear a woman singing, do not seek the source. 4. Never accept an invitation to dine, no matter how it is delivered. 5. Keep every door closed behind you, especially at night. 6. Do not look directly at the portrait in the main hall after dusk. 7. If the fireplace lights on its own, leave the room immediately. 8. Should you find a child wandering the halls, do not speak to it. 9. Cover all clocks before sleeping. 10. Never follow the sound of footsteps, even if they are your own. The basement must remain locked at all times. 12. At dawn, you must be outside the house. Do not watch the sunrise from within. The rules bore no signature. They might have been scrawled by a servant who once worked here, or perhaps by someone who did not survive to explain them. Regardless of their origin, I took them seriously. Years of this work have taught me that the rules in haunted places are not arbitrary. They are warnings carved out of pain, left by those who came before. The first time I saw Harrington House in person, it loomed out of the fog like something exhumed rather than built. The structure was immense, with steep gables and rows of windows that resembled dark, sightless eyes. Its once white exterior had weathered to a sickly gray, streaked with rain rot. Vines clung to its walls like skeletal fingers, and the iron gate that encircled the property was flecked with rust. I remember pausing at the threshold, the list of rules crumpled in my pocket, and wondering how many before me had read the same words and crossed this same path. Inside, the air was heavy, stagnant, as though the house had been holding its breath for years. The foyer stretched high above me, a cathedral of wood and shadow, dominated by a massive portrait at the far end. It depicted a man in 19th century dress, stiff with dignity, his eyes painted with unnerving precision. I did not need to check the list to know which rule applied to him. The first day was uneventful. I walked the halls, cataloging the rooms. The mansion contained over 30 chambers, most layered in dust and cobwebs. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, though it was still early in the day, far from midnight. The mirrors on the second floor were veiled with cloth, which suggested that someone before me had honored the second rule. The kitchen was stocked with rusting utensils but no food. I noted the fireplace, which appeared dormant. The clocks. There were many. Tall grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, even pocket watches sealed in glass cases. Their faces all pointed to different times, their ticking absent, as though time itself had abandoned the house. As daylight dwindled, the silence thickened. Old houses creak, but this one seemed to sigh. I set up my recording equipment, infrared cameras and motion sensors, more for procedure than expectation. I had learned long ago that spirits rarely reveal themselves through devices. They prefer to touch flesh, not wires. Still, I felt safer with the red lights blinking in the dark. That night, as I prepared to sleep in one of the smaller bedrooms, I followed the 9th rule and draped cloth over the clock in the corner. Its face was cracked, yet I had the sense it was watching me. Covering it gave me little comfort. I lay in bed with my journal on the nightstand, noting the stillness of the house. My eyes closed slowly, heavy with travel and tension. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to sound. Not a creak or a sigh, but singing. A woman's voice, distant yet clear, threading through the corridors. The melody was soft, almost mournful, a lullaby with no words. My instinct was to rise, to trace the sound, to capture the evidence my employers had paid for. But the rule burned in my mind: if you hear a woman singing, do not seek the source. So I stayed in bed rigid, heart pounding. The voice drifted closer, then paused outside my door. I clutched the blanket tighter. After a moment, it moved on, fading down the hall, until the silence returned. Sleep did not return with it. When dawn finally broke, I obeyed the final rule and stepped outside before the first light filled the halls. The air beyond the gate was crisp, and the forest swayed with morning wind. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The house had not claimed me, at least not yet. But as I turned back, I saw the curtains of an upstairs window shift, though every room I had checked the day before was empty. Someone, or something, was already watching. And that was only the first night. The second morning, I remained outside longer than necessary, unwilling to step back into the mansion's stale breath. The forest that surrounded the property was not comforting, but it was alive. Birds called to one another from the trees, a squirrel skittered along a branch, and sunlight dappled the undergrowth in warm patches. I had spent my life exploring places rumored to be haunted, yet I realized how rarely I had appreciated the simple miracle of normal sounds: wind, leaves, animals going about their business without malice. Harrington House made me long for the ordinary. By mid-morning, discipline compelled me to return. This was not a vacation. I was under contract, and if the owners demanded a month's worth of investigation, then I had to face 30 dawns like the one I had just endured. I walked back through the iron gate, its hinges groaning, and mounted the steps to the massive front door. When I opened it, the air seemed colder than the night before, though the sun had already risen. I tried to convince myself it was only the house's design, its high ceilings trapping shadows and draft. Convincing myself was the only way forward. I spent much of that day documenting the architecture. Harrington House was designed in the Gothic Revival style, with pointed arches and ribbed woodwork carved by hands that must have bled for their detail. The east wing contained more rooms than the floor plan suggested, narrow hallways twisting at illogical angles. One chamber opened into another without apparent order, as though the house itself had grown instead of being built. The mirrors there were uncovered, each framed in ornate silver. I resisted the temptation to examine them closely, obeying the second rule. A sheen of dust obscured the glass, but every time I passed one, I had the uncanny sensation that something behind the surface was moving just out of sight. In the afternoon, I returned to the foyer and stood before the enormous portrait of the man I assumed was the patriarch of the Harrington family. His face was long, his jaw sharp, his eyes dark wells painted with almost unnatural depth. I remembered the rule forbidding me from looking at him after dusk, but daylight offered no safety. The artist had captured something too precise, too alive. I found myself whispering, "Who were you?" under my breath before turning away quickly. That evening, as I made my notes, I noticed a new sound, the steady ticking of a clock. The clocks had all been silent the day before. I followed the sound through the corridor until I located a grandfather clock standing upright against the wall. Its pendulum swung lazily, though no one had wound it. I reached to cover its face with cloth, but before my hand touched the glass, the pendulum froze mid-swing. The ticking ceased. I withdrew my hand. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, for it carried a suggestion that the house had reacted to me. I forced myself back to the bedroom before midnight, covering every clock in the vicinity. I had chosen the same room for consistency, though I was beginning to suspect the house did not appreciate repetition. That night I lay listening to the creaks and groans, trying not to anticipate the return of the woman's song. Hours passed in silence, but then came footsteps, measured, deliberate, pacing the hallway outside my door. The rule was clear: never follow the sound of footsteps, even if they are your own. The problem was that the footsteps stopped directly outside my door, and then another set began, echoing inside the room. I bolted upright, staring into the darkness. No one was visible, yet the sound traveled across the floorboards, circling my bed. It took everything I had not to switch on my flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to illuminate the intruder, but I knew from experience that light sometimes only makes their forms more vivid. Instead, I pressed my back to the headboard and kept my eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the circling presence. After several long minutes, the sound ceased. I could still feel the weight of invisible eyes studying me until exhaustion dragged me into uneasy sleep. The third dawn found me outside once again, grateful for air that did not taste of mildew. Yet when I glanced back at the mansion, the same upstairs curtain twitched, exactly as it had the day before. The repetition unsettled me. It suggested an intelligence at work, a deliberate signal that my arrival and departure were being observed. I decided then to investigate the source of that window. It was on the second floor, near the end of the hallway overlooking the garden. When I entered the chamber, I found it abandoned like the rest, the curtains hanging limp. Dust clung to the floorboards, except near the window itself, where faint impressions marred the dust, as though fingers had been dragging along the sill. I crouched low and studied them. The marks were recent, clean through the dust, though no body had stood there in decades. It was at that window that I first heard the child. A voice, thin and high, like a boy no older than 8. "Mister," he called faintly, as if from the hallway. The sound froze my blood. The rule was explicit: should you find a child wandering the halls, do not speak to it. I turned slowly, pulse hammering, and saw a small figure standing at the far end of the corridor. The child was barefoot, his clothes old-fashioned, like something from the 19th century. His face was pale, eyes wide, and he raised one hand as though to beckon. I clenched my jaw, refusing to answer. My silence stretched heavy. The boy tilted his head, waiting. Then, when no word left my mouth, his body simply folded into the floor like a shadow dissolving, leaving nothing behind but empty air. I shut the door to the windowed chamber and leaned against it, my breath rag. The house was not content to watch me. It wanted to engage. Each rule I followed seemed less like guidance and more like a challenge the mansion resented. That evening, as I tried to eat a cold meal from my provisions, I discovered an envelope on the dining table. My equipment bag had been beside me the entire time. No one had entered the room. The envelope was ivory-colored, sealed with wax bearing a crest I did not recognize. My stomach dropped when I read the front an invitation, written in elegant script. Mr. Mercer, your presence is requested at dinner, 9 o'clock sharp. The Harrington family. My hands trembled as I set it back down. The fourth rule glared at me. Never accept an invitation to dine, no matter how it is delivered. I shoved the envelope back into my bag without opening it. But the house had its own plans. At precisely 9 o'clock, the dining room door swung open on its own, and the chandelier overhead blazed to life. The long mahogany table was no longer dusty. It gleamed. Crystal glasses sparkled, silverware shone, and platters of steaming food appeared as though conjured. Roasted meats, bowls of potatoes, loaves of bread. Everything smelled achingly real, mouth-watering after days of dry rations. At the far end of the table sat empty chairs, their backs carved in ornate Gothic shapes. I swear I could feel presences settling into them, invisible yet undeniable. The air shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from unseen bodies. A chair near me scraped back, though no one touched it. The scent of food grew overpowering, nauseating rather than enticing. I backed out of the room step by step, refusing to cross the line between temptation and damnation. Once beyond the threshold, I slammed the door. The clatter inside stopped instantly. When I dared to open it again minutes later, the table was bare, the chandelier dark, the dust returned as if centuries had never left. That night, my sleep was a storm of nightmares. I dreamt of the boy whispering secrets through walls, of the man in the portrait stepping down from his frame, of the clocks all striking midnight in unison, though their faces bore no hands. I awoke drenched in sweat, and for a moment I could not remember which world was the dream. The following morning, I began to question not only my safety but my sanity. The rules had been written for survival, yes, but obeying them was tearing me apart. To resist voices, sights, and invitations demanded a strength I did not know how long I could maintain. Yet breaking even one might mean forfeiting everything. On my 5th day, the house escalated its assault. The fireplace in the sitting room roared to life without spark or tinder. Flames licked the stone, casting the room in feverish light. The 7th rule shouted in my memory, if the fireplace lights on its own, leave the room immediately. I did. I turned and fled into the hallway, but as I glanced back, I saw shapes moving in the flames, faces screaming silently, pressed against the fire as though it were glass. They vanished the moment I blinked. I kept moving, deeper into the corridors, desperate to outpace whatever the mansion was trying to show me. But the house shifted around me. Corridors led where they had not before. Doors opened into unfamiliar chambers, and I found myself standing before a stairwell that descended into darkness. My throat tightened. The basement. The 11th rule. The basement must remain locked at all times. Yet the door now stood open, its lock broken, the stairs yawning downward into blackness. A cold draft rose from below, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and iron. I did not descend, but I lingered too long, staring into that abyss. Somewhere in the dark, I heard chains dragging slowly across the floor. I slammed the door and forced the lock closed with a chair, my pulse battering against my ribs. Every rule seemed determined to test me in rapid succession, as if the house had grown impatient with my restraint. That evening, when the sun sank once again behind the forest, I stood outside in the yard, staring up at the looming windows. For the first time since I had arrived, I allowed myself to speak aloud, my voice hoarse and angry. "I will not break your rules," I told the house. "Do you hear me? I will not." The curtains in the upstairs window parted again, but this time, instead of closing swiftly, they remained open, and silhouetted against the fading light was the figure of a man. Tall, rigid, his outline too sharp to be illusion. He stood motionless, watching me. I knew then that the portrait in the foyer was no longer confined to paint, and the night was still young. I did not sleep the night after seeing the silhouette at the upstairs window. I paced the yard until dawn, too afraid to re-enter the house, too bound by the rules to stay outside once morning broke. The 12th rule was clear at dawn. I must be outside, but I could not watch the sunrise from within. That meant once daylight filled the air, I had to go back inside and endure another cycle. As I stepped across the threshold that morning, the air of Harrington House seemed different. Not heavier, sharper, as though the house had grown aware that I was resisting, and now it meant to sharpen its teeth. The floors groaned not from age, but as though they registered my weight and judged it. The silence was no longer passive, it felt like waiting. I tried to hold on to reason. I told myself the rules were boundaries, not traps, and that if I adhered to them the house could not win. So I set about my daily notes with meticulous precision. I documented the shifts in temperature, the odd acoustics of the hallways, the placement of each clock and portrait. But my writing kept trailing into repetitions, the same words appearing again and again, as though my own hand were betraying me. I would scrawl the phrase, "Don't look, don't look, don't look," without meaning to. When I realized what I had written, I nearly tore the page out, but I forced myself to leave it intact. Records are not just for clients. They are anchors for the mind. That afternoon, I felt a change in the East Wing. I had avoided it after dark, per the first rule, but in daylight I forced myself to walk its length. Dust swirled in shafts of light from narrow windows. The air there was colder, the smell of mildew stronger. When I approached one of the uncovered mirrors, my reflection seemed wrong. The angle of my head was slightly off, my eyes looking elsewhere though my real gaze was steady. I turned away quickly, pulse hammering. The second rule had not needed to warn me. Instinct told me what would happen if I touched that glass. As I left the East Wing, the singing returned. This time it was faint, like a lullaby threaded through the walls, yet not near enough to tempt me. I pressed my palms over my ears and hurried back to the foyer. But there, my eyes betrayed me. The great portrait of the Harrington patriarch loomed at the far end, and I glanced at it without thinking. Daylight still bled through the high windows, but the painting had changed. The man's head was no longer facing forward. His chin had tilted down, his gaze fixed directly on me. I stumbled back, colliding with a table. My journal slid to the floor. I forced myself to look away, to fix my eyes on the staircase until my breathing steadied. When I dared glance again, the portrait was as it had been, the man staring forward with aristocratic coldness. Yet I knew what I had seen. The rules did not forbid looking at him in the daytime, but perhaps the house was reminding me that boundaries meant nothing if it wanted them to dissolve. That night, I resolved to rest in a different room. The bedroom I had chosen no longer felt safe after the circling footsteps. I moved to the western chamber, smaller and lined with bookshelves. Before bedding down, I checked every clock and covered each one. The silence was oppressive. Near midnight, a sound startled me awake. Not footsteps this time. Lauder, high, brittle, and wrong. It echoed faintly, as though coming from the walls themselves. I held my breath and listened. The laughter grew louder, shifting into multiple voices, overlapping in dissonance. My stomach turned. Then the voices began to speak, but not in any language I recognized. The syllables scraped my ears like metal dragged across stone. They rose in pitch, shrieking, until I thought my skull would split. I pressed the pillow over my head, desperate to muffle the noise, but the sound came from inside my skull as much as the walls. And then, silence. I lowered the pillow cautiously. The room seemed unchanged, yet my hands trembled uncontrollably. On the nightstand lay my journal. Its pages were open, though I had left it closed. Across the paper, in ink that was not mine, a single sentence repeated in uneven scrawl: "Eat with us. Eat with us. Eat with us." I slammed the book shut and shoved it into my pack. My breath came fast, ragged. The invitation to dine had not ended with the letter. It was relentless. The next day, I avoided the dining room entirely. I forced myself instead to map the upper floors, noting each locked door, each sealed chamber. The third floor contained rooms filled with dust, shrouded furniture, decayed wallpaper, and windows sealed with boards. Yet one chamber near the northern corner smelled strongly of roses, though no flowers existed anywhere on the grounds. Inside, a cradle rocked slowly as though stirred by unseen hands. I left immediately, the door slamming behind me, though I had not touched it. That evening, when dusk crept across the sky, I sat in the foyer, determined to confront the portrait. The rules only forbade me from looking after dusk, but I wanted to see what would happen when the moment struck. The last sliver of daylight vanished. Darkness filled the windows, and the moment it did, the painted man's head turned fully, snapping toward me with a speed too fast for paint. His lips parted, teeth gleaming white, though no breath escaped. His eyes were pits of black, bottomless. I staggered back, colliding with the staircase. The air chilled instantly, my breath fogging. Then, from the walls, came a low hum, rising, vibrating through the wood. The chandelier above shook, dust drifting down. I tore my gaze away. But even with my eyes squeezed shut, I felt his stare pressing against me, as though the painting itself had become a doorway, and something was leaning through. I fled into the western chamber, heart hammering, bolting the door behind me. That night, the singing returned. Not outside the door, but inside the room. The lullaby whispered directly at my ear, though no one stood beside me. I curled on the bed, clutching the blanket, refusing to respond. At dawn, I staggered outside like a drunkard. My body ached as though I had been beaten. I had survived, yes, but survival felt less certain each day. On the 7th morning, the house revealed its cruelty in a new form. As I prepared my equipment, a door opened in the foyer. Slowly, smoothly, without sound. From within, a figure emerged, the child again. His bare feet left no prints on the dust. His pale face tilted with curiosity. "Why won't you talk to me?" he asked softly. I kept my lips sealed, my jaw locked. He stepped closer, his eyes wet with tears. "Please, I'm lonely." The urge to comfort him nearly undid me. He looked so small, so fragile, but the rule was absolute: do not speak. When I said nothing, his expression twisted into anger. His mouth opened impossibly wide, teeth jagged, his eyes black pits. A shriek split the air, rattling the windows, a sound no human child could produce. Then he crumbled into dust that vanished before touching the floor. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my ears, the echo of that sound still vibrating in my bones. The house was escalating, testing me harder, punishing me for endurance. I realized then that 30 days might be impossible. My employers could demolish Harrington House 100 times over. It would not matter if I did not survive the month. That night, I heard something I had dreaded since the beginning: my own footsteps. They echoed down the corridor, matching my pace, though I stood still. When I tried to move, The echoes moved in opposite rhythm, approaching fast. I pressed myself against the wall, refusing to follow, refusing to break the rule. The air chilled around me, my breath white in the dark. The echoes stopped inches away, and for one dreadful moment, it felt as though someone stood directly in front of me, their face nearly touching mine. Then the footsteps receded into nothingness. When dawn broke, I stumbled outside once more. But this time, I was not alone. At the edge of the forest stood three figures. They were indistinct, like silhouettes carved from mist, but tall and unmoving. They did not shift or breathe. They only faced the mansion. I shouted at them, but they made no reply. When I blinked, they were gone. I turned back toward the house, and for the first time I admitted the truth I had been denying. Harrington House was not only haunted, it was inhabited, occupied by something that obeyed no human law. And those rules, as arbitrary as they seemed, were not protections. They were negotiations. A contract. And contracts are always written by the stronger party. By the 8th dawn, my body was failing. Each night left me weaker. And every day the house invented new torments. The list of rules had once seemed like a lifeline, but now it felt more like a leash. I could not stop obeying, because to disobey meant death, yet obedience itself was hollowing me out. The mansion was not content to frighten me. It wanted to erode me, to grind down my reason until I was raw enough to accept its bargains. When I stepped inside that morning, I felt the air pulse. It was not a trick of nerves. The entire house inhaled. I stood in the foyer and realized that for the first time, I did not feel like an intruder in a ruin. I felt like prey entering the jaws of something that had been waiting. The portrait of the patriarch hung silent at the end of the hall, yet I dared not glance at it. I kept my head down and forced myself into the west chamber to organize my notes. My journal pages were warped from sweat, the ink blurred, but still I wrote day 8. Entity growing stronger. Rules holding, for now. That afternoon I decided to test the boundaries. I had followed the rules without fail, yet the house escalated anyway. Perhaps obedience was not survival. Perhaps resistance was. I retrieved my camera and crept toward the dining hall, intent on provoking evidence. The door was ajar inside. The table was once again laid for a feast. Roast meats glistened, bread steamed, wine shimmered in crystal goblets. At the far end, where before I had sensed only presences, there now sat figures. Not solid, not flesh, but outlines of men and women drawn from smoke, seated upright, their hands resting on the table. Their faces were blurred, yet their eyes glowed faintly, as though coals smoldered inside their skulls. One of them raised its head and looked directly at me. Its mouth opened, though no sound came. Another raised a goblet. A third extended a hand in invitation. My throat clenched. The rule thundered in my mind, never accept an invitation to dine. My hand trembled as I lifted the camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit the room for half a second, and when my vision cleared, the table was bare, the chairs empty, the dust thick once more. When I checked the camera screen, the photograph was pure black, though the memory card confirmed it had been taken. That night, the retaliation came. As I lay in bed, every clock in the house began ticking at once. A cacophony of gears and pendulums, filling every corridor with relentless rhythm. I pressed the pillow over my head, but the sound grew louder, until it felt like my heartbeat had synchronized with the clocks. Then, in perfect unison, they all chimed midnight. The walls shuddered, my lamp shattered, and the door to my room burst open. He entered. The man from the portrait stepped through the threshold, tall and rigid, dressed in 19th century finery that looked untouched by dust. His face was exactly as painted. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, lips curved in the faintest smile. But he was no canvas. He was real. You read the rules, he said. His voice was deep, cold, echoing through the chamber though his lips barely moved. "And yet you stay." I could not speak. My throat had locked. He stepped closer, his boots silent against the wood. "Do you think they protect you? Do you think obedience earns favor?" He leaned down, his eyes inches from mine. "They are not rules. They are invitations." I shook my head violently. His smile widened, splitting too far, exposing teeth that seemed longer than human. "Every soul who enters this house writes their own survival. Those words in your pocket are the remnants of others. They failed. You will fail too." He straightened, and the room grew impossibly cold. Behind him, the walls darkened, as though the house itself were bleeding shadow. I forced my voice through my throat. "I will not break them." His expression sharpened into hunger. "Then you will starve." And with that, he dissolved into smoke that seeped into the cracks of the floor. The clocks fell silent. I sat frozen until dawn. On the 9th morning, I considered leaving for good. My contract meant nothing compared to my survival. But when I tried to cross the iron gate, I found it locked. I had never locked it myself, yet now the mechanism would not budge. No matter how I strained, the bars held. The house had closed its jaws. That night, the woman's song returned. This time it came not from the hall but from inside my room. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head, refusing to listen. The melody grew louder, angrier, until it became a shriek. The windows shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor. I curled beneath the blanket, praying for dawn. But dawn did not come. I awoke to find the light outside still dark, as though night had refused to end. The clocks showed no hands. My watch was frozen. Panic clawed at me. The 12th rule demanded I be outside at dawn. But what if dawn never arrived? Was the house spending time itself, trapping me in perpetual night? I staggered into the corridor, desperate. The mansion was alive with sound. Footsteps, laughter, the scraping of chains from the basement, the rocking of the cradle upstairs. Every rule at once, every warning manifesting together. The air vibrated with energy, a storm of spirits pressing against me. I ran, through the foyer, past the portrait whose eyes now followed me openly, into the east wing where mirrors rippled like water. Reflections lunged toward me, their hands pressed against the glass, their mouths mouthing silent pleas. I did not touch them. I kept running. At last, I reached the front door. It stood open, wide, spilling moonlight onto the steps. I staggered through, half believing freedom was mine. But outside, the world was wrong. The forest was gone. The gate was gone. Only darkness stretched in every direction, an endless void. Harrington House stood alone on an island of stone, floating in nothing. The door slammed behind me. I turned slowly, heart quaking, and saw that the mansion was no longer ruin. Its walls gleamed white, its windows lit with golden glow, its roof pristine. Laughter and music spilled from within, the sound of a gala in full swing. Through the glass panes of the foyer, I saw people dancing, their faces blurred, their movements graceful. The house was showing me itself alive, and then the man stepped onto the balcony above, the patriarch. His eyes burned like coals. He raised his hand in welcome. "Come," he said, his voice filling the void. "You have already dined with us in dreams. One word, and you will dine for eternity." I realized then the truth. The rules were not written to keep me alive. They were designed to keep me from belonging to him. Every command was not a prohibition, but a choice point. To break them was to accept his offers to eat, to follow, to listen, to touch. To keep them was to resist, and resistance was the only shred of self I had left. I shouted into the void, my voice breaking, "I refuse!" The laughter ceased instantly. The music died. The figures in the windows froze. The patriarch's smile faltered. "You refuse?" His voice shook the air. "Yes," I said, louder, though my knees trembled. "I refuse your food. I refuse your song. I refuse your lies. I refuse you. The mansion shuddered. Cracks split the pristine facade. The golden glow flickered, revealing rot beneath. The figures in the windows twisted, their blurred faces stretching into screams. The balcony splintered beneath the patriarch's feet, and he howled, not in anger, but in something like despair. The void collapsed. Darkness surged inward, swallowing the house, the balcony, the music, everything. I woke on the grass. The sun blazed overhead. The forest surrounded me once more. Harrington House loomed behind, rotted and gray, its windows black. My body ached. My skin cut by glass, but I was alive. The rules fluttered from my pocket, the paper now blank, every word erased. I did not question my survival. I staggered to my car, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove until the mansion was only a memory in the mirror. I never returned. The owners received my report, a single page with only 4 words written at the center: demolish it at once. Whether they listened or not, I cannot say. I only know that sometimes, in dreams, I still hear the faint echo of a lullaby, and when I wake, my clocks are never where I left them.